Is there anything more terrifying than watching a mighty emperor betrayed by his own flesh in his final moments? Power can collapse through war, rebellion, or palace intrigue. But nothing is more horrifying than a downfall from within when the very body begins to rot, piece by piece. This was the gruesome fate of King Philip II of Spain. A monarch who once struck fear across Europe, he was not defeated by hostile alliances or scheming courtiers, but by an invisible enemy, the agonizing decay of his own body. Imagine walking through the cold, dim corridors of the Escorial Palace in the summer of 1598. Gone are the rituals and resounding church bells, replaced by the faint stench of death and hushed whispers from terrified servants. In the very place where absolute power once reigned, all that remained was a rotting figure, trembling and bound to his bed by a disease no one dared to name. This is not just a tale about the fragility of power, it is nature's most brutal verdict against the arrogance of kings. What is happening to Philip II of Spain, once the supreme monarch of his age, the ruler of the first true global empire in history? From the Americas to the distant Philippines, lands that still bear his name to this day, his power stretched across the world without ever knowing a sunset. As the son of Emperor Charles V, Philip inherited control over half the known world and ruled it with an unshakable will. He was the iron hand of Catholic orthodoxy during the Counter-Reformation, both revered and feared, as he launched mighty fleets against England and financed bloody campaigns to eradicate Protestant heresy across Europe. Yet the most brutal battle of his life was not fought on the high seas or distant battlefields, but within the stifling walls of his own royal chamber. For 52 agonizing days beneath the scorching Spanish summer sun, the king who once held the power of life and death across the globe lay motionless, his royal body rotting from within, not at the hands of enemies, but by creatures so small they made his humblest subject seem colossal. They devoured him, bit by bit. Absolute power, in the end, was no match for the silent, merciless decay eating him alive. This is not merely a story of pain. It is a chilling meditation on the fragility of power, the inescapable grip of mortality, and the brutal equality of decay. The Escorial Palace, built by Philip II as both his sanctuary and sepulchre, became the stage for his final and most harrowing chapter. Inside its cold stone walls, a monarch who once ruled an empire where the sun never set was laid low not by enemies, but by his own rotting flesh. Disease, infection, and swarms of parasites breached the body of a king, rendering him helpless in the palace he had once commanded. Eyewitnesses described his final days in such ghastly detail that for centuries, historians dismissed them as exaggerated. Modern medicine confirms otherwise. This is the true account of Philip II's agonizing descent. A death so drawn out, so grotesque, and so humiliating that it stands as a timeless memento mori. Beneath the embroidered linens of a royal bed, the body of a sovereign quietly decayed, alive and conscious. Inch by inch, he was devoured not by war or rebellion, but by the lowest creatures of the earth. His decline began in the spring of 1598. At 71, Philip was already a relic of his era, long plagued by gout that had twisted his hands and feet into useless knots. Pains spread to his knees, shoulders, and wrists. Arthritis froze his limbs until he could not even lift a finger to scratch his head. By 1591, he was consigned to a wheelchair, yet he continued to govern, signing decrees that shaped continents with a single scrawled "No." But in June of that year, the storm broke. Fevers ravaged him, abscesses bloomed across his knee and hand, bursting, healing, and returning with vengeance. Medieval treatments failed. Bloodletting and poultices did nothing. The king became bedridden, motionless, save for his head and left arm. His regal discipline crumbled under the weight of bodily ruin. Once the axis of the Catholic world, Philip now lay steeped in his own waste, dignity stripped away, attended by servants who could not change the sheets fast enough. In death, as in life, Philip II was a ruler, but it was his final, helpless surrender, not his victories, that revealed the brutal truth. No empire, no crown, no fortress of stone can shield a man from the worms. In the scorching heat of the Spanish summer of 1598, King Philip II of Spain, once ruler of half the known world, was reduced to a decaying husk. His body, riddled with abscesses and erupting pustules, emitted a stench so foul it seeped through the palace walls, forcing courtiers to flee or mask their faces with perfumed cloth. Lice swarmed his festering wounds, feeding on his blood and dead flesh. Maggots hatched in the open lesions, thriving in his sweat-soaked bedding. Some burrowed beneath the skin, consuming him alive. Daily, servants scraped away larvae by the handful, only to return the next morning to a renewed infestation. Even the wounds themselves open, weeping, and cavernous became ecosystems of rot, large enough to expose his bones and fill silver basins with putrid matter. Flies nested not only in his sores, but in his mouth, nose, and ears. He could not move, barely breathe, and screamed in torment whenever touched. His gout made each shift unbearable. Bed sores devoured his flesh to the bone. His limbs swelled grotesquely from organ failure. Diarrhea and fever made him unrecognizable. The king, conscious to the end, watched as his sovereignty decayed. He, once divine in the eyes of men, had become a living carcass, consumed by vermin. The Escorial he built as his legacy became his tomb of horrors. Even holy sacraments offered no reprieve. Flies gathered on anointing oil, drawn by the scent of death. His final breath rattled with the gurgle of fluid in his lungs. His body, a theater of suffering, his legacy drowned in rot. At 5 o'clock on the morning of the 13th of September, a frail voice whispered one last prayer. Philip II of Spain, once the most powerful man in the world, breathed his final breath beneath the weight of a crucifix pressed to his chest. The monarch who had ruled empires across oceans, who had summoned fleets and armies with a word, had now been conquered by decay, by disease, by the smallest of foes. Death did not come to Philip swiftly. It lingered, mocked him, and hollowed him out inch by inch. When his lifeless body was finally handed to the royal embalmers, they faced an unimaginable task. His corpse, already collapsing from within, began to fall apart the moment they tried to move it. Embalming became an act of desperation. Perfumes, spices, and chemical preservatives were heaped upon him in vain. As decomposition outpaced every attempt to preserve dignity, the stench was so overwhelming that the rituals of death were hurried, essential prayers muttered, the casket sealed, and the body rushed beneath the Escorial, hidden forever beside the bones of emperors and queens. But history doesn't hide well. Word of the king's horrific end raced across Europe. In Protestant England and the Netherlands, where Philip was seen as a brutal oppressor, his suffering was met with a cold satisfaction. Pamphlets gleefully painted his death as divine vengeance for the tortures of the Inquisition and the rivers of blood spilled during the Dutch revolt. Even Queen Elizabeth I, his greatest rival, remarked solemnly, "We should not mock the afflictions of princes, for they remind us all of our common mortality." In Catholic Spain, the truth was softened. Chronicles glossed over the grotesque. They spoke instead of his holy devotion, his sacramental calm, and his pious death. The people were told their king had passed as he had lived, a rock of Catholic virtue. But beneath the incense and Latin liturgies, his body had become a battleground. His gout, likely evolved into crippling rheumatoid arthritis, had left him immobile. Signs of diabetes and quenchable thirst, swelling pointed to deeper dysfunction. Infections took root, pustules burst and refilled, bed sores opened into gaping wounds, maggots crept in. The king who once ruled millions was being devoured alive by inches. This was no mere illness, it was a horrifying inversion of all he had once been. A monarch who had condemned heretics to fire could not stop worms from burrowing into his flesh. A man who had claimed divine right found no miracle in his hour of need. Instead, he rotted, abandoned, not by men, but by the very God he had served so ruthlessly. His death was not just an ending, it was a symbol. The slow unraveling of Philip's body echoed the unraveling of the empire he built. His successor, Philip III, inherited not strength, but the shadow of trauma. Lacking resolve, he turned from responsibility to pleasure. Power slipped through Spain's fingers. The golden age faded into rust. And what of El Escorial? The vast palace Philip designed to be the heart of a global empire slowly shifted into what its cold stone walls had always suggested a tomb. Today, tourists walk its quiet corridors, hearing stories of royal piety, but not of the vermin. The true story, raw, hideous, unforgettable, lurks in the silence. Because in the end, this is what remains. Not the empire, not the wars, not the titles, but the manner of his dying. Philip II, the man who ruled half the known world, was undone not by enemies, but by his own rotting flesh. His suffering was not private, it was recorded, examined, remembered. His final lesson is as terrifying as it is profound. That absolute power cannot protect us from the laws of decay, from the humiliations of mortality. It cannot even promise us a peaceful death. He is remembered not for his triumphs, but for his disintegration, not for how he ruled, but for how he was consumed. And perhaps the bitterest irony of all, among his private papers after his death, a line was found: "To have been and not to be is not to be at all." For a king obsessed with legacy, that might be the cruelest legacy of all. His death far eclipsed any glory he achieved in life, etched into the memory of humankind as a tragic requiem for the impermanence of power. It reminds us that all glory fades, every throne crumbles, and in the end, nature forces all living beings, from kings to paupers, to kneel before the same law, to return to dust. Not in a moment of grandeur, but inch by inch, in agonizing surrender, until nothing remains but the ashes of pride.